if you own a piece of memorabilia from an evil regime in order to demonstrate to your children so that people remember for the future what that evil regime was, this means you're now a fan of that thing, according to Kevin Cruz.
I know this is going to come as a surprise to Ben Shapiro, but I actually don't need to collect Nazi memorabilia to remember that I hate Nazis, nor does anybody.
This is the actual thing they're going for. According to the Washingtonian, when Republican megadonor Harlan Crow isn't lavishing Justice Thomas with free trips on his private plane and yacht, he lives a quiet life in Dallas among his historical collections. These collections include Hitler artifacts, 2 of his paintings of European cityscapes, a signed copy of Mein Kampf, assorted Nazi memorabilia, plus a garden full of statues of the 20th century's worst despots, who is just a ridiculous human being, a pseudo-academic over at Princeton University who has somehow avoided plagiarism charges that have gotten him kicked out of the university. He tweeted out, "I've spent decades of my life researching and writing about white supremacists, and no, I don't have any paintings or statues of them in my house because that's not something you do with the people you hate." What's he talking about there? Well, apparently, Harlan Crow collects basically memorabilia from defunct communist and Nazi states, and he has a garden in which he displays these things to show what the capitalistic free market and Judeo-Christian ethic has overcome.
So this clip from Ben Shapiro is absolutely unbelievable and just clearly shameless, and there's 2 reasons why. First and foremost is just the fact of Clarence Thomas hanging out with somebody who literally collects Nazi memorabilia, and the entire right wing just pretending like that's a normal thing that people do. Like, oh yeah, that's the perfectly normal thing and definitely not indicative of your political views. Because the truth of the matter is that if somebody is running around collecting a bunch of Nazi memorabilia, that is probably a pretty good indicator of their political views. Most people don't need to collect memorabilia, and it's pretty clear that the overwhelming majority of people would consider that to be deeply, deeply offensive. Because, and I know this is wild, when it comes to remembering horrific events like the Holocaust, the focus really should always be on the victim and their experience of persecution, not the symbols of their oppression. There's definitely a place for understanding the history of Nazism and the tactics that they used to rise to power, but Ben Shapiro wouldn't be very happy about understanding those things because, of course, Ben Shapiro, being a member of the right-wing media, is pretty much an active participant in those same types of tactics. I mean, quite literally, the Republican Party right now is hyper-fixated on demonizing trans people in very much the same way that the Nazis demonized trans people. But then there's the other layer to this that I think is also important. At the end of the day, this was supposed to be a story about potential corruption, which is Clarence Thomas hanging out with somebody who is incredibly wealthy, going on vacations with them, getting a lot of perks from them that he says are just symbols of friendship and things like that. But I think most people would recognize to be emblematic of some level of corruption. But unfortunately, that type of corruption is very normalized in the United States of America. We just sort of take for granted that elected officials and Supreme Court justices are just going to be hanging out with millionaires and billionaires on a regular basis, and that it definitely won't affect their political views whatsoever. And that's, I think, part of the reason why right-wingers are so hyper-fixated on, like, trying to argue the point as to whether or not this person is a Nazi because they collect Nazi memorabilia, as opposed to recognizing the fact that maybe their relationship with Clarence Thomas is a little bit more than just being friends and could potentially be indicative of some type of corruption that exists within our political system more broadly. They don't want to have that conversation, but because that conversation, at least to regular working class people, is pretty straightforward. I think most people, whether or not it fits the legal definition of corruption, would consider that to be corruption in its very core essence. So of course, you have right-wing grifters running around trying to make these arguments about why they think it's totally fine and normal for this guy to collect Nazi memorabilia, as opposed to having the question of, is it fine or normal for Clarence Thomas to be hanging out with people like this and potentially be involved in what I think most people would at least colloquially refer to as corruption? They don't really want to have that conversation.